On the 12th of May, 2017, a doctor at a London hospital begins his shift just like any other morning. He glances at the monitors, and a bright red window is glowing on every single screen. A countdown is ticking in the middle. At the very same moment, assembly lines in huge automobile plants in France grind to a halt. At German railway stations, travelers stare at the information boards, but instead of timetables, they see the same red window everywhere. One might suspect a targeted attack coming from a particular direction, yet almost simultaneously servers belonging to Russian ministries, banks, and government agencies also go down. What is happening here knows no borders. Within a few hours, panic grips half the world. In several regions of England, ambulances carrying stroke and heart attack patients turn around in the middle of their journeys because hospitals can no longer accept them. Across roughly 150 countries, hundreds of thousands of computers are paralyzed, and at that moment no one fully understands what has hit them. The same window appears on every monitor in an aggressive dark red designed to create maximum psychological pressure. The message coldly explains the situation. All files have been encrypted and access has been completely lost. Two counters are running backward. The first gives 3 days to pay the equivalent of $300 in cryptocurrency, otherwise the amount will double. The second counts down 7 days until the keys are permanently destroyed and any chance of recovering the data becomes impossible. What brought the world to its knees that day did not come from the mind of some brilliant criminal sitting in a dark basement. It had been cobbled together from fragments of a genuine digital superweapon, and that weapon had been secretly developed for years by the government of the United States. For decades, Microsoft Windows contained a serious vulnerability that no one knew about. That in itself is nothing unusual. Almost every piece of software we use every day contains undiscovered flaws of this kind. But what happens when someone finds one? The vulnerability in question was buried in a fundamental protocol called SMB version 1, an ancient technology dating back to the 1980s that handled file and printer sharing on local networks. It was full of holes and hopelessly outdated by modern security standards. And one organization knew about that flaw: the National Security Agency, the American Intelligence Service. Under the United States government's own rules, security agencies are required to notify a manufacturer when they discover a critical vulnerability so that it can be fixed. But the same rules contain a convenient exception. If a vulnerability is considered too valuable for national security, it may be kept secret. The NSA judged this flaw to be too valuable. Instead of warning Microsoft and protecting millions of computers, the agency kept the knowledge to itself for more than 5 years and built an unusually powerful attack tool around it. They called it Eternal Blue. The tool made it possible to break into a remote computer, gain the highest privileges, and do so without being noticed and without a password. Microsoft itself later compared the weapon to a cruise missile from a military arsenal. And the intelligence agency managed to lose its cruise missile. In the summer of 2016, a hacker group calling itself the Shadow Brokers appeared. To this day, no one knows for certain who was behind it, whether insiders within the intelligence community or someone else entirely. What is certain is that they had gained access to NSA servers and extracted its top-secret arsenal of hacking tools. At first, they tried to sell it at auction for an astronomical sum. No one paid. In April 2017, they finally released everything for free on the darknet. For Microsoft, this was an enormous threat, because the tool for exploiting the Windows vulnerability was now available to anyone. Yet, as it turned out, the company had already released a patch 1 month earlier that fixed the flaw. Most likely, knowing that its own systems had been compromised, the intelligence agency warned Microsoft before anyone else could turn the weapon against virtually any Windows computer. But a patch only helps if it is actually installed. For individuals, running an update is easy. In large organizations, it is not. Many computers at the time were still running very old Windows systems, where regular updating was barely realistic. Thousands of organizations, including British hospitals, simply ignored the update. In government agencies, the problem is even more difficult because every software change has to pass through countless layers of approval. And this is exactly where the creators of WannaCry enter the story. The Lazarus Group, a highly specialized hacking unit linked to North Korean military intelligence, is widely considered the most likely developer of the worm. A large part of its mission is to obtain money for the regime while bypassing international sanctions. They were among the first to recognize the potential of the leaked attack code. But time was running out, because with every passing day the patch spread farther, and the number of vulnerable machines shrank. There was no opportunity to build anything truly sophisticated. So they took the American cyberweapon, Eternal Blue, and, almost literally, taped a simple ransomware module onto it. Less than a month after the leak, they unleashed the whole thing on the world, while corporations with billion-dollar budgets stared helplessly at their red screens. A young Briton stepped onto the stage who had barely left his room the entire time. Marcus Hutchins was 22 years old at the time and lived with his parents in a quiet town in southwest England. He was one of those people who skipped university and taught himself everything, and he was exceptionally good at it. After school, he worked remotely for an American cybersecurity company. Online, he was known as Malware Tech. On that 12th of May, he came home, saw the flood of reports about the collapse of the British Health Service, and began digging into the problem. He quickly realized that the speed at which the infection was spreading around the globe did not look like an ordinary piece of malware that needed a host. It looked like a worm, a self-contained program capable of reproducing itself and infecting other devices without any human involvement. Marcus obtained a sample of the malware and ran it in an isolated environment where dangerous code could be observed safely. But just as with other specialists, the worm would not start for him. As he examined the code, he noticed a strange, apparently meaningless domain name. Out of habit, he checked whether the address had been registered and was surprised to discover that it was still available. Every time the worm launched, it sent a request to that exact address, even though nothing existed there. Marcus had a useful habit. Whenever he saw an unregistered domain, he bought it. And that is what he did here as well, for about $10, intending to redirect the traffic to his company's servers and measure the true scale of the disaster. To understand what happened next, you need to know the cat-and-mouse game between attackers and defenders. Specialists examine malware only in isolated environments, and attackers want to prevent exactly that. So they build in checks. Before starting, the malware contacts an address on the internet to determine whether it is running on a real computer. Defenders responded by making their test environments answer every request positively, imitating a genuine connection. With this worm, however, the logic was reversed, and that was the trick. It deliberately contacted an address that was not supposed to exist on the real internet. If it received a response, the worm concluded that it was trapped in a laboratory environment and shut itself down. If there was no response, it assumed it was free and attacked. The moment Marcus registered the address and redirected the traffic to his servers, the domain suddenly began responding, and worms all over the world received the same signal. The address is responding, therefore I am in a laboratory, therefore I am being analyzed. All replication stopped, and no new infections occurred. At that exact moment, Hutchins did not even realize that he had completely disarmed the worm. At most, he had hoped to count the number of victims. At first, they even feared that registering the domain might make the attack worse, and were ready to shut it down again. But they avoided any rushed decision, and suddenly they had saved half the world. The worm could no longer launch because all its copies believed they were under observation, and all of it happened because a young man sitting in an ordinary room had brought one domain online. The digital security of the entire world now depended on one curious fact. As long as that address responded, the copies of the worm remained asleep. The moment it went silent, they would wake up again. A new danger appeared immediately. Once it became known that this single domain was slowing the spread, attacks began against its servers. If those servers fell, the sleeping worm could awaken. At the same time, British tabloids began hunting for the person behind the malware tech nickname. By the very next day, his identity had been exposed, his face appeared on front pages, and on the third day, reporters were knocking on his parents' door. A major internet service provider stepped in and gave the team full server protection free of charge. The servers held, and the worms did not wake again. To this day, millions of requests hit that address every month, an echo from sleeping copies that keep checking whether the coast is clear. Perhaps one of your own computers is carrying such a worm at this very moment, ready to wake up if the domain ever goes down. Only 3 months after stopping the outbreak, Marcus Hutchins flew to the United States to attend 2 of the oldest and biggest conferences in the hacking and cybersecurity world. He was welcomed with honors because he had become a legend, the modest young man who had defeated a digital monster almost single-handedly. A week in the blazing heat of Las Vegas passed in a blur of exclusive parties and job offers from Silicon Valley. He was too dazzled to notice the tinted black sport utility vehicle that appeared several mornings outside the villas where the parties were being held. Exhausted after a week of non-stop partying, Hutchins arrived at the airport to fly home. He passed through security and sat down in the lounge. At that moment, armed United States Marshals and FBI agents quietly approached him. Handcuffs closed around his wrists. In front of other passengers, he was led out of the terminal and taken to a detention facility where he was subjected to an intense interrogation. The man who, 3 months earlier, had stopped one of the worst cyber attacks in history was now facing a criminal case himself. To understand why, we need to go back again. Marcus had been a withdrawn and lonely child living in an isolated area, and the only people who shared his main interest were members of underground hacker forums. He quickly learned how to steal passwords, and before long he had built his own network of thousands of hijacked computers. By the age of 15, he was already running an illegal business, renting out server capacity for fraudulent websites. In his teenage mind, none of it felt entirely real. The machines in his network did not feel like people, and stolen passwords did not feel like real money. At 16, an anonymous client contacted him and paid well. Marcus was asked to write a tool that could secretly control a computer from a distance. He agreed. Technically, it was a masterpiece. Morally, he kept telling himself that he had not crossed any real line. He was spying, yes, but he was not stealing money. Then the client asked for more. A function that could intercept the connection between a person and their bank and steal money from accounts. Only then did Marcus understand what he was building. He tried to quit, but the client had leverage over him. The man knew Marcus's real address because Marcus had once bought drugs from him. "If you walk away," he threatened, "I will turn you in to the FBI." Marcus chose what seemed to him the lesser evil. He revised the program but refused to write the actual banking module. The client hired another programmer for that part, and by the summer of 2014 the combined code was finished. It was named after a Greek titan, Kronos, one of the most powerful banking Trojans of its time, which targeted customers of major banks in several countries. Marcus did not steal money directly and received no share of the proceeds. He was the hired architect whose real name no one on the forums knew, but he understood that the code he had written was now emptying the accounts of real people. He began pulling away. He shut down his server business, stopped using drugs, and created an anonymous profile where he did exactly the opposite of what he had spent years doing. He took other people's malware apart and publicly explained how to defend against it. That was where the head of the American cybersecurity company discovered him and offered him a job. Marcus accepted and continued working from the same room in his parents' house. In August 2017, he was charged on several counts, all related to the development and distribution of Kronos. He pleaded not guilty. Almost a year later, prosecutors, determined to make an example of the case, expanded the indictment. They added the most serious accusation: lying to the FBI. According to the prosecution, Hutchins had denied during questioning that he knew his code was connected to Kronos. He was now facing up to 40 years in prison. His defense team asked the court to suppress his statements, arguing that Hutchins had been questioned immediately after his arrest while in a state of extreme exhaustion, and that, as a foreign national, his rights had not been properly explained to him. The judge rejected all of those motions. Knowing that the conviction rate in American federal cases exceeds 95%, Hutchins made a difficult decision in the spring of 2019. He accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts related to the development of the code. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the remaining charges. In his public statement, he expressed genuine remorse and described his actions as mistakes of his youth that he deeply regretted. On the 26th of July, 2019, a federal judge in the state of Wisconsin faced a difficult moral question. On one side of the scale were the proven actions of a teenager. On the other, the extraordinary achievement of an adult who, with a single move, had protected critical infrastructure around the world from destruction. The judge imposed a lenient sentence. Hutchins avoided prison. He received credit for the time he had already spent in custody and was placed under supervision for 1 year, while the judge also waived all financial penalties. In explaining the decision, the judge said that Hutchins had opened a new chapter in his life, left criminal behavior behind, and that there was far too much positive material on this new page to ignore. Because of the conviction, Hutchins was expected to leave the country after his supervision ended. Today he lives in Los Angeles, continues working in cybersecurity, and even runs his own channel where he explains complicated subjects in very clear language. Things did not end well for the attackers either. Their worm was stopped within just a few hours, and only a few hundred people paid. Although the damage to the global economy was estimated at several $billion, the attackers collected barely more than 100,000. And no one who paid got their files back. They also never secured the unregistered domain that was available for $10. Had they controlled that address themselves, Marcus would never have been able to redirect the traffic and stop the worm. The most common explanation is that they were in a hurry because every day of delay meant more computers were receiving the protective update. The worm really does look unfinished, assembled from a weapon built by an intelligence agency and an extremely simple encryption module, almost as if the two had been taped together. It was not especially elegant work, but it was very loud. The hackers of the Lazarus Group left no signature that could conclusively identify them. Yet almost all researchers agree that there are few plausible alternatives. Entire sections of the worm's code were found to match code used by North Korean attackers in earlier operations. It was a digital pattern that was difficult to overlook, and a case in which one government's lost weapon became a catastrophe for countless ordinary people.